There's a difference between being a good person and being too available. The liar thrives on this confusion. He feeds off your impulse to believe, your desire to avoid conflict, your willingness to keep the peace at any cost. And before you know it, you're explaining the obvious to someone who's not interested in the truth, just in the outcome they can squeeze out of you. The liar doesn't need to be brilliant. He just needs to find, in you, a spot where your conscience hesitates. A spot where dignity becomes negotiable. A spot where guilt is easy to trigger. There are people who aren't manipulated because they see everything. They're not manipulated because they respect themselves enough not to need to prove anything. And that's a kind of freedom you can't buy with cleverness, but with internal structure. Maybe you know the feeling of walking away from a conversation wondering, how did I end up agreeing to that? Or the discomfort of realizing that someone always manages to flip things around, making you seem like the one who's exaggerating, too sensitive, distrustful, ungrateful. The liar usually has a specific skill. He doesn't argue to clarify, he argues to confuse. And when he confuses, he takes up space. The goal isn't truth. It's dominating the emotional ground. There's a painful detail. The liar almost never wins by force. He wins by your rush to end the discomfort. Wins because you prefer a false harmony to the risk of a rupture. Wins because you still believe that if you explain it right, the person will finally get it. But lies aren't misunderstandings. Lies are strategies. And strategy isn't beaten with explanation. It's beaten with boundaries and clarity. Stoicism would say, what you control isn't the other's character, but your response. You don't control the game the other plays, but you control whether you'll sit at the table. You control whether you'll keep offering access to your emotions, your time, your resources, your attention. And that's a crucial shift. Manipulation thrives where access is easy and consequences are low. When access gets more expensive, not in money, but in boundaries, the liar loses his edge. But what makes someone leave access easy? Usually, it's not a lack of intelligence. It's emotional need. It's fear. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being seen as harsh. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing a relationship. Fear of being alone. Jung would call this a complex, an old emotional core that, when touched, hijacks your clarity. You can be very rational most of the time, but as soon as someone hits your sensitive spot, guilt, neediness, the need for approval, you start acting like someone who's not you. You turn into a child trying to keep affection. Turn into a teenager trying to prove worth. Turn into someone who apologizes for existing. The liar notices this, not always consciously and Machiavellian, but he notices. He tests. He measures. He observes what you tolerate. And if you tolerate once, tolerance becomes precedent. That's how manipulation grows, not as a blow but as an infiltration, a concession today, another tomorrow, a let it go here, a not worth arguing there. Until one day you wake up feeling like you're living a life where your choices are always pushed by someone else. The first step to becoming someone hard to manipulate isn't learning to catch the liar in contradiction, as if life were a courtroom. That might happen, but it's not the heart of the issue. The first step is learning to sustain discomfort, because truth often brings immediate discomfort. Lies offer quick relief. And the liar exploits exactly that. He offers an easy emotional out, while your intuition calls for firmness. Think. How many times have you swallowed something just to avoid a conversation? How many times have you pretended to believe because you didn't want to seem distrustful? How many times have you felt guilty for setting a simple boundary? Manipulation uses guilt as a master key, and too much guilt is a deformed virtue. It seems like empathy, but it's fear of displeasing. Seems like kindness, but it's insecurity disguised. The Stoics talked about living according to virtue. Virtue here isn't moralism, it's integrity. It's being consistent with what you consider fair, even when emotion tries to push you toward cowardice. And there's a virtue the liar hates: tranquility. The tranquil person doesn't react at the liar's pace, doesn't rush to defend themselves, doesn't get disorganized to prove innocence. They listen, observe, ask short questions, and sustain silence. And silence is a mirror that many manipulators can't stand because in silence they can't direct your emotion. Jung would add, the liar also relies on something inside you that wants to be seen as good. The persona, the social mask, can become a prison. You try to be the understanding one, the loyal one, the patient one, the one who always lets it slide. But when you live just to keep a mask, you become predictable. And predictability is raw material for manipulation. The liar knows you don't want to seem cruel, so he stretches the rope. Knows you avoid conflict, so he threatens conflict. Knows you want to be fair, so he plays victim and pushes you into the guilty spot. The question that changes the game is intimate and uncomfortable. What in me makes the other's lie easier? Not as an accusation against yourself, but as maturity. Because if you don't look at that, you switch liars and repeat the pattern. The same dynamic can show up at work, in family, in marriage, in friendship. The face changes, but the mechanism is the same. Someone lies, you hesitate, you give in, you get frustrated, you blame yourself, and it all starts over. There's a point where the mature person understands. I don't need to convince anyone of my truth. I need to be faithful to it. Convincing is a need of the wounded ego. Fidelity is a decision of conscience. The liar wants to drag you into the field of endless discussion because endless discussion tires. And when you tire, you give up parts of yourself. The integral person doesn't argue to win. They set boundaries to preserve themselves. This is where another crucial difference emerges. Kindness isn't absence of boundaries. Kindness without boundaries turns into naivety, and naivety turns into resentment. The liar counts on your naivety until you turn resentful, because the resentful is easier to control. They react with anger, get confused, lose credibility. The person who preserves themselves, on the other hand, stays clean inside. They don't need to shout to be respected. They simply withdraw when they notice the distortion. But how do you get to that point? It's not a technique, it's a construction. You build an internal identity that doesn't depend on external validation. You strengthen the ability to say no without over-explaining. You learn to notice when you're being pushed to justify everything, as if you're on trial. You notice when you're being induced to choose between being loved and being true. And when that choice appears, you decide that truth is worth more than applause. There's another aspect almost no one considers. Many liars don't just lie with words. They lie with emotional climate. They create urgency, create drama, create confusion, create triangulations, make you feel like you need to respond now. And urgency is a weapon, because the mind under urgency loses nuance. The Stoic would train the opposite, the pause. The pause returns inner governance. The pause is an, I'll think about it. It's a I don't decide today. It's a send it in writing. It's a I need to check. Simple phrases, but they take the liar out of the environment where he's king. The environment of pressure. And there's still your shadow. Jung would say that what you don't recognize in yourself becomes an open door. If you don't recognize your own anger, you can be manipulated by someone else's anger. If you don't recognize your own need for approval, you can be manipulated by praise and crumbs of affection. If you don't recognize your fear of abandonment, you can be manipulated by threats of distance. The liar is like a musician. He plays the strings that already exist. He doesn't create your vulnerability from nothing. He exploits it. That's why becoming someone hard to manipulate is internal work before it's social work. It's learning to stand firm when the other tries to bend you with emotion. It's learning to endure the discomfort of not being understood. It's accepting that some people will call you cold when you start being clear. Will call you selfish when you start respecting yourself. Will call you distrustful when you start observing. That's part of the price of integrity. And it's a much smaller price than the cost of living betraying yourself. There's a specific serenity in those who already understand that peace isn't absence of external conflict. It's absence of internal war. You might even have difficult conversations, break bonds, make hard decisions. But inside, you remain whole. Because you're not trying to save an image. You're just staying faithful to what's real. The path that will be developed from here on is simple in form, but demanding in spirit. Strengthen the center so the other's lie finds nowhere to cling. It's not about becoming distrustful of everyone, bitter, or closed off. It's about becoming lucid. And lucidity is a form of self-love. It protects what's precious in you without needing to harden the heart. A lot of people believe the best defense against liars is having proof. Knowing details, saving messages, remembering dates, catching contradictions. That helps, sure, but it's not the center of protection. The experienced liar doesn't fall because you have a fact. He falls when you stop offering the reaction he needs. Because the raw material of manipulation isn't the lie itself, it's your emotional state after the lie is thrown. Observe the pattern. He asserts something confidently, and what happens inside you? A rush to respond, an urgency to clarify, an impulse to justify, a fear of seeming unfair, a desire to fix the vibe. That's where the person gets captured. The liar knows that if he provokes confusion, you'll try to restore order. And in your effort to restore, you start to give in. The first practical step is simple but requires self-control. Slow down the speed. Not because you've become apathetic, but because you've chosen not to be led by the other's emotional rhythm. Stoicism would call this mastery of impressions. The impression is the mind's first read. He's right. I'm wrong. If I don't respond now, it'll get worse. If I disagree, I'll lose. The training is to insert a space between the impression and the response. That space is your freedom, and that space can be built with short, neutral phrases that return the weight to the right place. I understand. I need to think. I'll check. I don't decide today. Send it in writing. Repeat, please. What do you mean exactly by that? Notice, none of these phrases attack. None open endless discussion. None offer long justifications. They just interrupt the flow of pressure. And pressure is where the lie thrives. The liar usually tries 3 moves to control the scene. The first is urgency. He creates a sense of now or never, so you choose under adrenaline. The second is inversion. He makes you believe you're exaggerating, that you're distrustful, that you're ungrateful. The third is fog. He talks a lot, changes the subject, mixes details, makes the topic tiring because tiredness turns into concession. The mature person learns not to enter these games. Here comes a Stoic principle worth gold. Don't debate where there's no good faith. There are conversations that resolve, and there are conversations that just spin. The liar likes to spin because, while spinning, he keeps occupying your time, your energy, and your attention. He wants to keep you in reactive mode. And reactive mode has a characteristic. It takes away your dignity without you noticing. You start talking too much, proving too much, explaining too much. And the more you explain, the more he finds gaps to distort. A powerful protection is abandoning the need to be understood by those who don't want to understand. That need is one of the easiest doors to open inside a person. Jung would say that when you need the other to understand to feel at peace, you've handed them the governance of your worth. And that's a subtle form of dependence. You become vulnerable because the other's approval becomes the court. The liar loves being the court. So the armor starts with an internal question. What am I trying to save here? In many cases, it's not the truth. It's the image. You want to seem fair, want to seem balanced, want to seem kind, want to seem smart. And when the image rules, you become manipulable. Because the liar doesn't need to win an argument, he just needs to threaten your image. Just suggest that you're cold, harsh, paranoid, and boom, you enter the effort to correct how you're seen. The conversation stops being about facts and becomes a dispute over identity. The strongest path is to do the inverse. Keep the conversation on the ground of the concrete and responsibility. If someone asks you for something, you don't respond with emotion, you respond with criteria. What's the deadline? What's the agreement? What's the evidence? What changes if I say no? What part is my responsibility? These questions seem cold to those who feed on confusion, and that's exactly why they work. They remove the power from theater and return the conversation to reality. There's another point that's usually underestimated. The liar doesn't manipulate just by what he says, but by what he makes you feel. And he prefers specific feelings: guilt, pity, fear, rush, shame. If you learn to recognize these triggers, you start to see the structure behind the speech. For example, when someone says, "After everything I've done for you," the intention is usually to generate guilt, not clarity. When someone says, "If you loved me, you'd do this," the intention is to generate fear of loss, not build agreement. When someone says, "You're imagining things," they might be trying to generate shame and doubt, so you abandon your perception. When someone says, "You need to decide now," they might be trying to prevent you from thinking. The person who's not manipulated notices these attempts without turning aggressive. They don't need to accuse, just not react as expected. They can respond calmly, "I don't decide under pressure." Or, "I understand you feel that way, but that doesn't change my decision." Or, "If it's important, we can talk when there's respect." Note the point. You acknowledge the emotion without kneeling before it. You don't deny the other's feeling, but you also don't become its hostage. This requires a rare kind of emotional maturity, sustaining tension without justifying. For those raised with the idea that conflict is danger, this hurts. The body interprets disagreement as threat. The person tries to appease to survive. But adult life demands something else, learning that disagreement isn't death, silence isn't abandonment, and saying no isn't cruelty. This is where Stoicism is more than philosophy. It becomes daily practice. Courage isn't absence of tremor. Courage is acting despite the tremor. Jung would help go deeper. Why do you feel guilty when setting boundaries? In many cases because you've associated love with sacrifice. Learned that, to deserve affection, you need to give in, prove, carry, endure. And the liar notices this programming. He doesn't need to be sophisticated, just press the right key. "I'm not well. I need you. Only you understand me. You owe me." The person programmed to carry feels important for carrying, and that importance turns into handcuffs. One way to break those handcuffs is to develop a clear criterion for concessions. A healthy concession is one you make and still respect yourself after. An unhealthy concession is one you make and despise yourself after. That after is an underrated compass. When you abandon yourself, something inside you charges. It might charge as irritation, as tiredness, as coldness, as sadness. And many people, instead of listening to that charge, try to be even more good, entering a cycle of self-betrayal. The real protection against liars has a lot to do with consistency. The liar tests borders. If you say no today and give in tomorrow without a clear reason, he learns that just insisting works. If you ask for respect but tolerate disrespect to avoid problems, he learns that your word has no weight. What scares a manipulator isn't someone explosive, it's someone predictable in the best sense. Predictable in boundaries, predictable in criteria, predictable in consequences. That makes the game too expensive. Consequence isn't revenge. Consequence is coherence. If someone lies, the consequence can be simple. Less access, less intimacy, less trust, less partnership, less openness. Sometimes people think they need a dramatic confrontation, a final scene, a moral victory. But in most cases, the most elegant consequence is firm withdrawal. You retreat from the ground where the lie wants to rule. You don't argue to change the other. You adjust your presence to protect your mind. And there's a specific skill that changes everything. Asking questions that demand precision and don't offer emotional fuel. The liar likes vague phrases, because with vagueness he moves. The lucid person asks for precision. When exactly? Who said that? What was the agreement? What are you asking of me directly? What part of this is your responsibility? Questions like these work because they force the other out of theater and into the concrete. And when the liar can't, he gets irritated, changes the subject, accuses you of being difficult. That irritation is a sign you've touched the mechanism. But here's a caution. Don't turn questions into an interrogation. The goal isn't to humiliate anyone. The goal is to protect your clarity. If the person is in good faith, they'll clarify without attacking. If not, they'll react with offense, sarcasm, victimhood, rush, and you don't need to prove anything. You just register the reaction. A practical recommendation is to learn to recognize when you're being pulled into the role of defendant. The liar usually inverts. He errs and makes you explain. He fails and makes you justify why you felt. He distorts and makes you defend your perception. When you notice you're on the stand, stop, breathe, and return to the axis. I'm not here to prove my worth, I'm here to decide how I live. That phrase, said inside, returns your center. The more you develop that center, the less you need confrontations. Manipulation wilts when it finds someone who doesn't negotiate with guilt, who doesn't decide under pressure, who doesn't explain to deserve respect. And that doesn't make you harsh. It makes you free. A liar rarely enters through the door of logic. He enters through the door of your fragile point. That's why the solidest defense isn't memorizing debate techniques, nor developing a police nose for contradictions. It's knowing your own emotional structure. It's noticing which emotions make you lose your axis and which needs push you into concessions that later turn into shame and tiredness. There's a repeated pattern in almost every successful manipulation. The person doesn't give in because they fully believe the lie. They give in because the lie triggered a discomfort they don't want to sustain. It could be guilt. It could be pity. It could be fear of conflict. It could be fear of abandonment. It could be the need to seem fair. It could be the difficulty of tolerating the tension of a no being received with disapproval. The liar notices this, and when he notices, he doesn't need to be convincing. He needs to be insistent. Stoicism would call this fragility internal slavery, not in the sense of offense, but of diagnosis. When an emotion rules you, anyone who knows how to press that button gains power. And liberation, for the Stoics, starts when you learn to see the emotion as an internal event, not as a decree. You feel guilt, but don't obey automatically. You feel pity, but don't surrender to abuse. You feel fear of conflict, but still sustain the truth calmly. Emotion exists. Submission to emotion is another story. And Jung would add a fundamental detail. Many of these automatic reactions don't start today. They come from much earlier. The adult, in certain moments, reacts with the urgency and fragility of an old internal part. It's as if an old complex takes the wheel. A criticism turns into, I'll be rejected. A harsh tone turns into, I'm in danger. A silence turns into, I've been abandoned. And when you live by these associations, you're not responding to reality. You're responding to a past that still rules. The liar doesn't need to know your story to use this. He just needs to notice your pattern. And your pattern often shows up in 3 common forms. The first is the need to over-explain. You feel like you need to justify every decision, every boundary, every choice, as if your existence needs to be approved by an invisible board. The liar loves this, because long explanations turn into material. He takes one of your phrases, distorts, exaggerates, and makes you go back to the start to explain again. You enter a labyrinth where the exit is always another explanation, and the tired mind, in the end, gives in just to end the where. The second is the impulse to save the other. You see suffering, real or staged, and feel you need to fix it. The liar can use this by creating frequent crises, urgent requests, sad stories, promises of change, last chances. And here's a trap. Helping is human. Being used is corrosive. When helping turns into obligation and the person never takes responsibility, you're not helping, you're being drained. The third is the fear of being seen as bad. For a lot of people, being firm seems synonymous with being cruel. Saying no seems synonymous with rejecting. Setting a boundary seems synonymous with abandoning. This confusion usually starts in environments where love came with demands, or where you needed to be nice to avoid punishment, or where peace depended on you not contradicting anyone. The liar finds this and uses it as leverage. You're being unfair. You're attacking me. You've changed. You don't care anymore. And if you believe firmness is evil, you back off immediately. The central point is this. Liars manipulate best when you live with easy guilt and weak boundaries. Easy guilt is that guilt that shows up even when you did nothing wrong. It's an automatic guilt, almost programmed. Weak boundaries don't mean lack of character. They mean lack of training. Training to sustain your own decision in the face of the emotional discomfort that comes after. Now, how to strengthen this in practice without becoming distrustful, cold, or bitter? The path goes through a kind of internal reconstruction. You stop measuring yourself by the other's mood and start measuring yourself by your principles. A Stoic would ask, am I being fair to myself and to the other? Justice here includes you. Many people confuse justice with unilateral sacrifice. If the other lies, distorts, demands, and you keep giving in to be fair, that's not justice, it's self-abandonment. Temperance also comes in. You need to moderate the impulse to fix everything, respond to everything, explain everything. Courage comes in when you sustain the boundary without threats, without spectacle, just firm. Wisdom comes in when you recognize patterns. What repeats isn't accident. Jung would take this inside. What in me fears displeasing? What part of me believes I need to earn respect? What wound gets desperate when someone threatens to leave? These questions aren't therapy in pretty words. They're tools for self-knowledge. The more you recognize these internal parts, the less they hijack you. You don't eliminate them. You integrate them. You say, inside, I understand your fear, but I'm the one deciding now. There's a simple exercise that changes posture. Before responding to pressure, ask yourself what your dominant need is in that instant. Need to be accepted? Need to avoid tension? Need to prove you're good? Need to show you're right? Many manipulations work because you're trying to satisfy an immediate emotional need and pay a high price later. When you name the need, you regain freedom. You can decide, I won't buy quick relief with self-betrayal. Another decisive skill is learning to recognize the difference between healthy doubt and induced confusion. Healthy doubt is when you really need to reflect, gather information, ponder. Induced confusion is when, after talking to someone, you feel weird, guilty, dizzy, as if reality has been messed with. The liar creates this state because, in a confused state, you seek stability, and he offers himself as the stability. Let me handle it. Trust me. You're misunderstanding. And if you hand him the role of interpreter of reality, you've become a hostage. The hard-to-manipulate person does the opposite. They check calmly and trust coherence more than speech. Coherence is a powerful word. Who speaks nicely can lie. Who promises can lie. Who cries can lie. But coherence over time is hard to fake. The integral person observes patterns. Does the other take responsibility? Does the other repair when they err? Does the other respect boundaries without punishing? Does the other accept a no without attacking you? This reveals more than any explanation. And here's a point many people avoid for fear of seeming harsh: the willingness to lose. Yes, lose. Lose approval. Lose the image of always understanding. Lose a convenient friendship. Lose the illusion of a relationship that only exists while you give in. As long as you're not willing to lose, you can be bought. The liar buys you with threat of loss. If you don't do it, I disappear. If you don't agree, I get offended. If you insist on this, it's over. Who can't stand loss becomes slave to blackmail. The Stoics would call this attachment to what doesn't depend on you. You don't control if someone will stay. You don't control if someone will approve. You don't control if someone will call you bad. But you control if you'll betray your values to avoid it. When you learn to endure the possibility of loss, blackmail loses force. And that doesn't make you indifferent. It makes you adult. Jung would say that part of this fear of losing comes from an unintegrated shadow. The difficulty of being alone with yourself. Who can't stand their own company tolerates almost anything to keep someone around. And that's dangerous. Because the liar can use loneliness as a threat. The cure in this case goes through building internal ground. Habits, silence, routine, purpose, healthy friendships. A life that doesn't depend on one single person. When you have ground, no one pushes you easily. There's also a subtle trap. Trying to win the liar on the field of morality. You want him to admit, to recognize, to apologize, to confess. And when that doesn't happen, you insist more, as if insistence would turn a pattern into regret. But many liars don't move by shame. They move by advantage. If you wait for regret to protect yourself, you'll stay exposed too long. Protection doesn't require confession. It requires decision. Decision, however, needs a criterion. A strong criterion is this: I don't debate my perception until I lose myself. If I saw something, if I heard something, if something was agreed, I don't accept that being erased by an emotional narrative. That doesn't mean being rigid, it means being faithful to the real. Another criterion: I don't negotiate fundamental boundaries under guilt. If the person tries to make you feel guilty for taking care of yourself, that's already information. Another criterion: I don't decide under imposed urgency. Legitimate urgency is rare. Manufactured urgency is common. And there's a simple, almost infallible test. Observe how the person reacts when you stay calm. When you don't defend, don't explain, don't attack, just sustain a boundary with serenity. Who is in good faith tends to seek understanding. Who is in manipulation tends to amp up the drama, raise the tone, provoke you, label you, try to knock you off center. Because the goal is to deregulate you. The lucid person understands, if someone needs my deregulation to win, that's not dialogue, it's dominance. All this at bottom points to an inner transformation. You stop living as someone who needs to be approved and start living as someone who needs to be integral. Integrity is the kind of strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't try to convince everyone. It doesn't rush. It observes, decides, sustains. And the liar facing that loses the ground where he usually operates, the ground of rush, guilt, and confusion. In the end, liars don't dominate because they're superior. They dominate when they find an open door in your interior. Too much rush, too much guilt, too much fear, too much need. They don't need to destroy your intelligence, just disorganize your calm. Just push you into reactive mode, where you explain, rush, justify, and start negotiating what's supposed to be non-negotiable: your dignity. Becoming someone who's not manipulated doesn't mean turning into a distrustful, bitter, always armed person. It means becoming someone centered, someone who knows how to sustain silence, someone who doesn't respond under pressure, someone who doesn't confuse kindness with submission, someone who understands that respect isn't begged for, it's chosen, demanded with serenity and confirmed with coherent consequences. Stoicism offers a simple and powerful base for this posture. You don't control the other's character, but you control your assent. You control the yes you give. You control the no you sustain. You control the interpretation you feed. You control if you'll turn your own life into a court where you need to defend yourself all the time. When you govern your responses, the liar loses the main instrument, your emotional reaction. And there's an even deeper point. Manipulation usually sticks because you expect the other to be fair. You expect good faith. You expect coherence. You expect that, if you explain better, the person will recognize and stop. But maturity starts when you accept a hard and liberating reality. Some people don't want clarity, they want advantage. And when you stop expecting them to change, you start changing what really is in your reach. The way you position yourself. Jung would remind that this positioning isn't just external, it's internal. Because while you don't recognize your own triggers, you'll stay vulnerable to who knows how to press them. If guilt rules you, you'll be pushed by guilt. If fear of abandonment rules you, you'll be pushed by threat. If need for approval rules you, you'll be bought by praise and crumbs. The true armor comes when you look inside and say, I recognize what I feel, but I don't hand my direction to it. And then the posture changes. You don't need to win discussions. You don't need to unmask anyone in public. You don't need to humiliate, accuse, get revenge. Just act with criteria. Just demand precision. Just refuse manufactured urgency. Just observe patterns instead of words. Just cut the emotional fuel that feeds the game. Manipulation starves when you don't offer drama, nor infinite explanation nor automatic guilt. From that point, life gets simpler, not in the sense of easy, but in the sense of clean. You start to notice that some conversations aren't for resolving, they're for measuring. Measuring if there's respect, if there's responsibility, if there's truth. And when there isn't, you don't insist. You don't wear yourself out. You withdraw with dignity. Dignity is the most powerful boundary because it doesn't need an audience. If you take just one thing from here, take this. Who gets manipulated easily usually isn't weak. It's just someone who learned to betray themselves to keep the peace. And that can be unlearned. You can learn to keep the peace without losing yourself. Can learn to be kind without being used. Can learn to love without begging. Can learn to listen without swallowing everything. Can learn to say no calmly and to leave games without needing a final explanation. If you felt this describes real experiences in your life, write in the comments what was the most common situation: guilt, urgency, victimhood, guilt inversion, repeated promises, or constant confusion. Leave your like to support the channel, share with someone who needs to strengthen boundaries without hardening the heart, and subscribe to follow content that unites emotional maturity, clarity, and inner firmness. And when you're done, do a simple exercise. Remember a recent conversation where you felt confused or guilty without knowing why. Remember calmly. Ask yourself, what button was pressed in me? The answer might not come right away, but when it does, you'll have found the door. And who finds their own door learns finally to close it with serenity.